Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Chapter 4 of our Freedom, Law, and Rights book, which is entitled Liberal Democracy. What we'll be talking about this week is the kind of political order the framers established via the U.S. Constitution. What kind of political order is that? Well, it actually has a technical name. If you open any major textbook in political theory, you will see that it says that the kind of political order established by the U.S. Constitution is termed a liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, that's the formal name for our kind of political order. Now, the framers themselves didn't use that term. It's relatively modern. They tended to call our government a republic, or sometimes a representative democracy, but modern scholarship routinely refers to it as liberal democracy. And the advantage of the modern term is this. Our political order has two distinct but related dimensions: the liberal dimension and the democratic dimension. You put them together and you get a liberal democracy. Now, as I said, the term highlights these two distinct dimensions, which we're going to explore today so that we can understand how these two distinct dimensions work together to constitute American political order. You may not know it, but what we're doing now in our classroom and in our course, Freedom in American Society, we are participating in an age-old tradition, a tradition that is usually called the liberal tradition. Now, that may be confusing to contemporary American listeners because the word liberal has changed meaning substantially over the course of the 20th century. The original meaning of the word liberal, it comes from the Latin word liber, L-I-B-E-R, which means free. And the liberal tradition is a tradition that explores the nature and meaning of the free society. Of course, in contemporary American society, to be a liberal is to be generally, you might say, an advocate of what Americans call big government, right? It is the party of big government. But that's the exact opposite of what the term liberal historically has meant in the Western and American tradition. To be a liberal meant that you were concerned with freedom and its corollary, which is limited government. So liberal democracy is sometimes also called a constitutional democracy, or sometimes a limited democracy. Those are all synonymous terms: liberal democracy, constitutional democracy, and limited democracy. The liberal tradition was generated over the course of many, many centuries, and scholars disagree as to who exactly is the first person to contribute to the so-called liberal tradition. Some people would say Aristotle, others would say Cicero, others would say St. Augustine, and so forth. But what we can say is that the liberal tradition was formed over many centuries by various thinkers living in different historical periods, who nevertheless were united by their concern with answering a common question. And the liberal tradition, or what I sometimes call the liberal question, is this. And it's a question that we ourselves have to answer. It's a perennial one for human beings. And the question is this: what is the proper range of governmental authority? Should government be permitted to control all aspects of human existence, or are there limits to government? And this question has been explored for many centuries. Unless you're willing to champion a totalitarian society, and what is that? A totalitarian society, just like the name sounds, is one where, and a totalitarian government in particular, is one where the government assumes the right to have total control over every aspect of existence. Totalitarian governments do not recognize any pre-existing limits to their authority or power. They claim the right to have total control. That's totalitarianism, and it has been a common occurrence throughout the 20th century, so much so that historians sometimes call the 20th century the age of totalitarianism. We saw numerous attempts to establish totalitarian societies, of course, whether communist, socialist, fascist, or whatever. But in all cases, a totalitarian government claims the right to have total control over all aspects of existence. It doesn't recognize any limits to its power. The exact opposite of a totalitarian government, which is another word for which would be an unlimited government, the opposite of that is what has been shaped and formed in the Western liberal tradition, and that is the idea of limited government. Do any of you believe that government has the right to have total control over every aspect of existence? What you think, read, feel, people you associate with, the professions you have, the foods you eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or are there limits to what government may legitimately do? That, as I said, we are participating in the liberal tradition in our freedom course by examining this very question. What are the limits, if any, to governmental authority? And we in the West, and in American society in particular, make the very strong claim that governments, in fact, are limited. We do not think that it is legitimate for government to control every aspect of human life. Government has its place. We saw that in our last chapter in discussing the purpose, the nature and purpose of government, according to Locke and the American founders. Government has its place. It is to use the resources we give it to secure the individual rights of every person, their rights to life, liberty, and property. So we are heirs to a tradition of limited government, that is the liberal tradition. Because all these thinkers who constitute the liberal tradition, in one way or another, were asking the same question. What is the proper range of governmental authority? What are the limits to governmental authority? And the thinkers have come up with different answers. We saw Locke's answer, which is the classic American answer. Locke is one of the chief founders of modern liberal democracy. And again, as we said, Locke says government has an important purpose, and that is to secure the natural rights of each and every individual. So that is the so the liberal tradition, as I said, thinkers were addressing particular historical circumstances, but they're all exploring this question, the liberal question, of the range or extent of governmental authority. Now, in the modern world, there have been two chief answers from within the liberal tradition to this question of what is the proper role of government in society. The first answer is what scholars generally refer to as the classical liberal answer, the doctrine of classical liberalism. And that is precisely what we've already discussed in the work of Locke. Government has an important role, but it is limited to the protection of what they call the rights of person and property, life, liberty, and property. Its characteristic or chief values are individual freedom and justice. And it's such a famous view of government that it has some epithets or nicknames attached to it. Government is the night watchman. What's the role of a night watchman in a warehouse? The night watchman is not there to do anything in particular, but to protect the property, just as government is to protect the rights of the individual. Government is sometimes called, as I said, the night watchman government, or the term laissez-faire is often associated with the classical liberal view of government. The term laissez-faire comes from outside of the Anglo-American tradition. It's obviously a French term, but it relates to this idea of limits on government. The story has it that the French king in the 18th century was asking the merchants of Paris. The king says to them, well, what can we do for you? What can the government do to help you? And reportedly the answer was laissez-faire, leave us alone, right? Don't do anything, don't intervene. So we have government as the night watchman, laissez-faire, limited government, who's limited to the protection of the rights of person and property. And freedom and justice are the characteristic values of that tradition. But there's also been another view developed throughout the course of the 20th century that scholars refer to as modern liberalism or progressivism. They're the same thing, modern liberalism / progressivism. And the modern liberal response to this liberal question of what is the proper role of government is quite different. it certainly is not as definite or defined as the classical liberal view. There's a famous political philosopher, John Stuart Mill, who lived in the 19th century. And he, in many respects, is regarded as the first modern liberal. And he's exploring this purpose of government. And he rejects the older classical liberal view that the purpose of government is limited to the protection of individual rights. And he says, no, the purpose of government is, in his words, the improvement of man, excuse me, the improvement of mankind. Purpose of government is the improvement of mankind. Okay, any problems with that we can foresee? Well, obviously, first of all, how do we define the improvement of mankind? If I asked each of you to write down, maybe I'll do that in our discussion question for the week. What would you recommend for the improvement of mankind? All right. Well, I'm probably going to get back as many different answers as there are students in our course. It's a very subjective question, because one person's idea of improvement could be very different from another person's idea. So is there any objective way to determine what the improvement of mankind would involve? And secondly, can we envision that there would ever be an end to the need to improve mankind? Can we somehow improve mankind to the point of perfection where no further improvement is possible? I think you would agree that the answer to that is no. So it's an endless, open-ended invitation for government to be actively and perpetually involved in shaping the social process. And this leads and has led to a kind of soft totalitarianism. I sometimes ask students, can you think of any area of human life today that is regarded as completely off limits to government, that government does not touch this area of life? I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any. Government today is involved directly or indirectly in almost every aspect of human existence. This is a result of the widespread embrace of moderate liberalism or progressivism. The chief values of that tradition are not freedom and justice, but rather material welfare and equality understood as equitable distribution of resources. There's an epithet or a name for that in American society as well. We call that big government, or big brother is watching you, right? So these two traditions, the classical liberal view and the modern liberal view, are really opposites in many respects. And the only thing they have in common is sharing the term liberal. We don't have time in this discussion to explain how the term liberal was transformed almost into its opposite throughout the course of the 20th century. But it starts with the progressive movement at the beginning of the 20th century and gradually develops through endless repetition to the point where today, as we said, to be a liberal is to be an advocate of big government and not of limited government in the Lockean sense. But both indirectly are attempting to answer this question of what is the proper role of government in society. Totalitarianism, which is not liberal in any way, is also an answer to the liberal question, though. As we said, if you are going to advocate for totalitarian government, what's the proper role of government in society? Well, it's anything. Government can involve itself and control every single aspect of human life. There are no limits to governmental power. So this is the liberal dimension of our society. And the John Locke, who is sometimes called, if you'd asked John Locke and the American framers, what's your political philosophy? They wouldn't have used the terms that we use in modern society, liberal, conservative, or whatever. Those terms didn't really develop until the 19th century. But they had a very definite political philosophy, certainly as we saw in the work of Locke. And so if you had Locke, remember we said there were opposing parties in Locke's society, those who advocated for the absolute power of the king and those who resisted it, and they were called Tories and Whigs. Locke was a Whig, W-H-I-G. He was a Whig, which meant that he was hostile to arbitrary power, the arbitrary power of the king. If you'd ask the American revolutionaries and founders in the 18th century, what's your political philosophy? Again, they didn't have the modern terms that we use. they probably would have said, we are Whigs. What united the Whigs was their hatred of arbitrary power, whether it came from a monarch or from a majority of the people. And they did everything they could to prevent the abuse of political power and the exercise of arbitrary power. So this is the liberal dimension. The liberal dimension insists, certainly the classical liberal dimension, insists on imposing pre-existing limits on the power of government. Nowhere in our tradition has there ever been anyone recommending unlimited government control until the modern times, where we see the demise of the classical liberal tradition and the rise of liberal progressivism. So that's why we say that a synonym for liberal democracy is a constitutional democracy. It's the Constitution that puts limits on the power of government, and sometimes also called a limited democracy. We have democratic elements in our political order, but they too are limited, again, by the higher law of the Constitution. So that's the liberal dimension. Again, the liberal dimension is concerned with the proper range or extent of governmental control. How far can government go, and why? And of course, the liberal tradition gives us answers. Locke writes his entire second treatise to make an elaborate argument, concluding that the government is limited to the protection of individual rights. And various other thinkers have also contributed to the formation of the liberal tradition. That's the liberal element, concerned with the range or extent of governmental power. But we also have a democratic dimension. Again, the formal name for our political order is a liberal democracy. So we have democratic elements. Now, what is democracy? This is another one of those terms we have to explore in some detail because it's widely misused, misconceived, and misunderstood.